Hello, it's Andrew Palmer here again with another short video for our reading group. This time I'm introducing our next book, which is Muriel Spark's The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. It was published in 1961, just 3 years after Alan Sillitoe's Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, which we discussed last time. It was Spark's sixth novel, and it tells the story of an Edinburgh schoolmistress and the effect that she has on a group of schoolgirls whom she has singled out as the Brodie set. And if we think of our overarching theme of literature and power, we can make interesting connections with Sillitoe's novel. For Arthur Seton, the factory was the source of his economic security. It gave him a steady income, but it was also at the heart of a system of control. He could game the system up to a point, but he couldn't truly escape it. In Spark's novel, in place of the Raleigh Bike Factory in Nottingham, we have the Marcia Blaine School for Girls in Edinburgh. In any state, the school system is one of its chief instruments. It's how the state makes good citizens, or rather obedient citizens. At its best, school can be an institution that educates, uplifts, and prepares children for life. But it's also an instrument of ideological instruction, socialization, and control. We can see a connection with Sillitoe's novel when Miss Brodie refers to the school as this education factory, and like Arthur Seton, she devotes herself to undermining its power. And also, again like Arthur, Miss Brodie is a character who probably inspires mixed feelings in the reader. We may at first see her unconventional approach as a liberal corrective to the straitjacket of a very conservative establishment. She seems to be a romantic, foregrounding art, literature, and a kind of philosophy at the expense of more obviously practical subjects. But as the novel progresses, we become increasingly aware that her eccentricity is founded on a disturbing kind of elitism. At one with this is her adoration of Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator who's recently taken power in Italy, and it seems that she later transfers her adoration to Adolf Hitler. Remember, this novel is set in the 1930s, the decade of the rise of fascism in Europe, but it was published in 1961, the year of the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust. So remember that context. And I'll be honest, when I first read this novel, I really wanted it to be a straightforward parable about fascism and the dangers of charismatic leaders. In this reading, the book becomes a kind of allegory. The school is a microcosm of 1930s Europe, and Miss Brodie is a miniature version of the fascist dictators, charismatic but dangerous. And some critics do read the book this way. One early reviewer of the novel called it, quote, a study of how evil may work through the ostensibly commonplace. But I find that Spark refuses us the simple pleasure of reading the book in this way. As Candia McWilliams says in her introduction, we, like the little girls, fall for Miss Brodie, nor do we ever, even when we have seen the consequences of her ways, relinquish our enchantment quite. Miss Brodie is egocentric, but also defiant. She's a comic figure, but also a tragic one. That's something to think about as you read the novel. Where do you think the balance lies? How are we to judge Miss Brodie? And how are we to judge the novel's other main character, Sandy Stranger? Sandy comes to understand that Miss Brodie's divine stance is a manipulative fraud, so she betrays her to the headmistress. The key incident involves a girl outside the Brodie set who dearly wants to be accepted into its ranks. Miss Brodie convinces her to travel to Spain to fight on the fascist side, and she is killed. In a simple reading, we might see Sandy as the moral force in the book. She sees that Miss Brodie is dangerous and decides that she must be stopped. And yet, Sandy is an odd, not entirely sympathetic character. Spark keeps emphasizing her little pig-like eyes, and when Sandy converts to Catholicism and becomes a nun, she seems like a very troubled nun who's constantly clutching the bars of the grill behind which she is trapped. And in case we were in any doubt about this ambiguity, Muriel Spark in an interview called Sandy, quote, a nasty little bitch. That's surprising, perhaps, and something to discuss when we meet. So this is a book that leads us towards certain conclusions, only to have those conclusions undermined or made complex in some way. This approach to storytelling is rooted in Spark's Edinburgh upbringing, a key element of which is what she calls the nevertheless principle. In her essay, What Images Return, she says the following: "My whole education, in and out of school, seemed even then to pivot around this word, the word nevertheless. My teachers used it a great deal. All grades of society constructed sentences bridged by nevertheless. It's my own instinct to associate the word as the core of a thought pattern. I find that much of my literary composition is based on the nevertheless idea." This nevertheless habit was also ingrained in her own life. Spark's father was Jewish, her mother Anglican, her school Presbyterian. She notes her father's habit of resisting dogma, of always seeing two sides and grey areas. So when we meet, we might discuss, where do we see this nevertheless quality in the novel? In the same essay, Spark adds, "It was on the nevertheless principle that I turned Catholic." So she converted to Catholicism in 1954, and from that point on, her attitude to her new faith was itself infused with this same nevertheless principle. She both adhered to her new faith and was critical of it. Religion has a central place in the novel. Edinburgh is the city of John Knox, the 16th century cleric who led Scotland's Protestant Reformation under the influence of the teachings of John Calvin. He instituted Presbyterianism or Calvinism, one of the central tenets of which is unconditional election, the idea that some people belong to the elect, predestined to receive salvation in the afterlife, whatever their actions, beliefs or qualities, and everyone else is damned, no matter what they do. One critic, a chap called Peter Kemp, connects Knox's Presbyterianism with Mussolini's fascism. Both, he says, are, quote, built around the concept of the chosen and the rejected. In the novel, Sandy sees that Miss Brodie has elected herself to grace in the manner of a narcissistic dictator. It seems to me that the role of religion in the novel is kind of complex. It can sometimes seem as a positive force and sometimes a negative one. Negative, for example, when Eunice Gardner has what Spark calls a religious turn, during which she stops hopping and skipping and becomes nasty and not to be trusted. Sandy is drawn to Catholicism during her brief affair with Teddy Lloyd, but also recognises that the Catholic Church contained, quote, quite a number of fascists much less agreeable than Miss Brodie. She becomes a nun, but is repeatedly described as clutching the bars of the grill. So there's something amiss there in her religious conversion. So Spark in the novel seems to set up an opposition between Calvinism on the one hand and Catholicism on the other, but it's a confusing opposition. So again, that's something we might discuss. How does that work in the novel? Take a look, for example, at the long paragraph in chapter 4 on page 85 of our edition, describing Miss Brodie's church-going habits. It's a paragraph beginning up to now. That's a passage we might discuss in detail when we meet. So I've talked a bit about what we might call the undecidability of the novel, and there's one element to Spark's narrative technique that really stands out and seems to complicate things in that regard. I'm talking about her habit of jumping forwards in time for brief accounts of future events and then jumping back. So in Silito's novel, we saw that he did use flashbacks, particularly in the opening passages where the character tumbles down the stairs and then we jump back in time to get the backstory and then we return to the tumble down the stairs. So Silito does flashbacks, but Spark does what we might call flash forwards. We haven't actually got a word for that, but the technical term is prolepsis, which is just a fancy Latin word that means to anticipate. So we're going to use that word in the absence of any other. For example, in 1931 in the novel, when the girls are 11 years old, Monica Douglas spies Miss Brodie kissing the art teacher, Teddy Lloyd. Most of the other girls don't believe her, and it's narrated as follows. " 'Rose is the only one who believes me,' said Monica Douglas. when she visited Sandy at the nunnery in the late 1950s, Monica said, "I really did see Teddy Lloyd kiss Miss Brodie in the art room one day." "I know you did," said Sandy. She knew it even before Miss Brodie had told her so one day after the end of the war when they sat in the Braid Hills Hotel eating sandwiches. So in that passage we jump from 1931 forwards to the late 1950s when Monica visits Sandy at the nunnery, and then we jump back to 1945 when Sandy visits a shriveled and defeated Miss Brodie shortly before the teacher's death, and then we jump back again to 1931 to resume the story. All of this is pretty disorienting. When Spark was interviewed by Mark Lawson on Front Row on Radio 4 in 2004, she said the following about prolepses. "I do that deliberately. The effect on the reader is more suspense than if they don't know. I don't know why it is, but if you know in advance what's going to happen, or a bit of it, the reader can't wait to see how it happened." I'm wondering if Spark's account there matches your experience of reading the novel. I'm not sure it quite matches mine, and I'm wondering what else might these prolepses achieve. We might add that, in fact, the novel begins in the future, as it were. The first 5 pages show the girls in 1936 when they're 16 years old, and after that we jump back to 1930 and slowly work our way forwards back to 1936 in the course of the novel. How do you experience that disorienting start to the book, and why do you think Spark tells it that way? Okay, so there's a few ideas and thoughts about the novel for you to ponder as you read. Enjoy the book, and I look forward to discussing it with you when we meet. Cheers.